$5 million. That's what it costs to bury the most wanted man on the planet. Not to celebrate him, not to honor him, just to put him in the ground while the entire world watched. December 4th, 1993, Medellin, Colombia. And the funeral of Pablo Escobar didn't look like the burial of a defeated criminal. It looked like the burial of a king. Stay until chapter 4, because the $5 million is not the most disturbing part of this story. What the crowd did when the coffin arrived is, 40,000 people showed up. Journalists flew in from 6 countries. His family had to fight through a mob just to reach the grave. And somewhere in that crowd, the Colombian government was watching, terrified that even in death, this man still had more power than they did. This is the story of the most chaotic, most expensive, and most revealing funeral in the history of organized crime. And it starts, like everything with Escobar, with a number that makes no sense until you understand the man behind it. Pablo Escobar's body was rejected by 3 countries before anyone agreed to bury it. 24 hours before that happened, he was the most powerful criminal in history, a man who had bombed presidential candidates, bribed entire governments, and built a cartel worth an estimated $30 billion at its peak. December 2nd, 1993. Colombian security forces cornered Escobar on a rooftop in a quiet residential neighborhood in Medellin. The shootout lasted minutes. When it was over, the man responsible for 80% of the world's cocaine supply had a single bullet wound behind his right ear. What happened next was a bureaucratic nightmare nobody had planned for. Colombia didn't want a martyr's grave on its soil. Panama refused entry. Spain, where Escobar had once tried to send his family into exile, declined before anyone even asked officially. His brother, Roberto Escobar, later recalled standing in a government office, being told politely, but firmly, that there was no protocol for this, that the state had spent 15 years trying to kill Pablo Escobar, and exactly 0 minutes planning what to do with the body after they succeeded. It took 48 hours of negotiation before anyone agreed on a location. And when they finally did, it was a small, ordinary cemetery in Medellin, called Jardines Montesacro. The cemetery had no idea what was coming. When you build an empire on fear, even your funeral becomes someone else's problem. The $5 million figure attached to Escobar's funeral wasn't spent by his cartel. It was spent by governments, media organizations, and security forces trying to control what happened next. His family had almost nothing left. The Colombian government had spent years seizing assets, burning properties, and dismantling the financial infrastructure of the Medellin cartel. By December 1993, Maria Victoria, Hanao Escobar's wife, was hiding in a Bogotá hotel with their 2 children and barely enough money to leave the country. The actual cost of the burial itself, the coffin, the plot, the logistics, was modest. What drove the number to $5 million was everything surrounding it. Colombian security forces deployed over 500 officers for crowd control. International media organizations chartered private planes. The government hired forensic specialists to confirm the identity beyond any doubt, because in a world where Escobar had faked his own movements for years, nobody trusted a body until 3 independent sources confirmed it. A Colombian photojournalist named Jesus Abad Colorado arrived at the cemetery expecting a small, controlled burial. What he found was a crowd so large that the funeral procession couldn't move. People were climbing trees, sitting on tombstones, pressing against the gates. He later described it as looking less like a funeral and more like a concert where the headliner had just been announced. The Colombian government had spent $1 billion trying to capture or kill Escobar over 15 years. The funeral cost more in 1 day in crowd control alone than the entire annual budget of the agency that eventually took him down. You can kill the man. You cannot kill the mythology on the same day. 40,000 people attended the funeral of a man responsible for thousands of deaths. International media framed the crowd as evidence of Escobar's criminal legacy. The people standing in that cemetery saw something completely different. In the neighborhoods of Medellin, the comunas on the hillsides where Escobar was born and where he built his earliest power, he had been something the Colombian state never was. Present, he built football fields. He constructed housing projects. He handed out cash at Christmas. Was it manipulation? Absolutely. Was it also the only economic mobility some of these communities had ever seen? Also, yes. Now that you know who those 40,000 people were, do you think the crowd was mourning a criminal or a system that failed them first? Drop your verdict in the comments. A woman named Carmen, interviewed by a Colombian journalist in 1993, her last name withheld for her safety, had received housing from one of Escobar's community programs in the late 1980s. She showed up to the funeral, not because she approved of what he did, but because, as she said, nobody else ever showed up for us. That quote ran in 3 international newspapers. It was the most uncomfortable sentence in every article that included it. The Colombian government was so disturbed by the size of the crowd that it immediately began a review of its own urban development programs. The funeral had functioned, accidentally, as a referendum. Power built on absence is still power. The burial itself nearly didn't happen. The crowd broke through security and surrounded the coffin. Authorities had planned a controlled, low-profile burial. 15 minutes, maximum press access, minimal ceremony. It lasted for hours. When the hearse carrying Escobar's coffin arrived at Jardines Montesacro, the crowd, which had been building since early morning, overwhelmed the security perimeter. Within minutes, officers were pushed back. Journalists lost their equipment in the crush. Escobar's family, including his mother, Hermelda, who was 67 years old, had to be physically shielded by bodyguards just to reach the gravesite. Video footage from the burial shows something extraordinary. People reaching over each other to touch the coffin. Not in violence, in grief. Hermelda Gaviria, Escobar's mother, collapsed twice before reaching the grave. When she finally stood over it, she turned to the crowd, this mass of 40,000 people who had come to bury her son, and she said, in Spanish, he was a good son. The crowd went silent for the first time in 4 hours. Colombian intelligence officials later admitted they had placed agents in the crowd not to prevent violence, but to photograph faces. They were building a list of everyone who showed up to mourn. The funeral had become, simultaneously, a grieving ritual and a surveillance operation. Even at the grave, the game doesn't stop. Within 72 hours of the burial, the Medellin cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history, effectively ceased to exist as a unified structure. While 40,000 people mourned, the cartel's lieutenants were already negotiating surrenders, switching allegiances, and dismantling safe houses. Escobar had been the organizational center of everything. His death wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was the collapse of the only person holding together a structure built entirely on personal loyalty and personal fear. The Cali cartel, which had been at war with Escobar for years, sent a message to Colombian authorities within 24 hours of his death. They were willing to cooperate. The Cali leadership understood, with clarity, that the funeral footage was being broadcast globally, and that the world's attention on Colombian organized crime had just reached its highest point in history. This was the worst possible time to be in the cartel business. One of Escobar's most trusted lieutenants, identified only as Navigant, in official Colombian documents, surrendered to authorities on December 5, 1993, the day after the funeral. He reportedly walked into a police station in Medellin, sat down, and said, "It's over." He didn't ask for a deal. He just stopped. The funeral that looked like a celebration of Escobar's power was actually the moment his empire ended. Not with a negotiation, not with a policy, with a burial that made 40,000 people realize, collectively, in real time, that the man they had feared, admired, or depended on was gone, and that nobody was coming to replace him. The funeral wasn't the end of the story. It was the proof that the story was already over. Here's what $5 million buys you at the end of an empire built on violence and fear. A grave that 40,000 people showed up to defend. A coffin that a government had to deploy 500 officers to control. A burial that accidentally became the most honest assessment of Colombian inequality in a generation. At the beginning of this video, $5 million sounded like an obscene number for a funeral. By now, it sounds almost small, because what Escobar's burial actually cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in what it revealed, that the most powerful criminal in history couldn't be contained even in death, that the systems designed to stop him had spent 15 years focused on the man and 0 years fixing what created him. Here's the question that matters. If you had been standing in that crowd, not as a journalist, not as an official, just as someone who grew up in Medellin, would you have been there? Be honest with yourself. Next video. A man worth $200 billion was declared legally dead while he was still alive and used that window to do something nobody in financial history had ever done before. Subscribe. It drops this week. See you in the next one.